India has enemies on every side. To the west, Pakistan, 4 wars in 75 years. Both countries have nuclear weapons, and Kashmir is still contested today. To the north, China, the largest military on Earth. In 2020, Indian and Chinese soldiers fought hand-to-hand at Galwan Valley, 20,000 feet above sea level. 20 Indian soldiers died and at least 40 on the Chinese side, and the border is still unresolved. At sea, China is building naval bases across the Indian Ocean, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Pakistan. A string of installations that military analysts call the String of Pearls, slowly surrounding India from the water. India sits in one of the most dangerous neighborhoods on Earth. If Pakistan and China ever coordinated, India is outnumbered on 2 fronts simultaneously against 2 nuclear powers. And yet, conquering India is basically impossible. Not unlikely, not difficult, impossible. Let me show you why, and then I'm going to show you something that nobody else making this video has mentioned. First, the land itself. To the north is the Himalayas, the tallest mountain range on Earth. A wall of ice and stone 500 miles deep with peaks so high that military helicopters cannot operate above them. No army in history has crossed the Himalayas to invade India. To the west, the Thar Desert. Summer temperatures exceed 50 degrees Celsius. No major army has crossed it in modern history. Then you have 2 oceans on 3 sides. South India is completely surrounded by oceans, and to the northeast you have the jungles of the 7 sister states. Dense and mountainous, built for ambush, not for marching armies. India's first line of defense is the planet itself. Second is the military. India has the world's 5th largest military. 1.5 million active personnel, and then another 2.5 million in reserves and parliamentary forces. The Air Force operates the Su-30 and the Rafale. The Indian Navy has 2 aircraft carriers and is building a 3rd. Third, India has something called a nuclear triad, which is the ability to launch nuclear weapons from the land, air, and from the sea. The Agni missile series covers all of Asia and most of Europe. The INS Arahant, a nuclear-powered submarine, carries ballistic missiles underwater, which means if every Indian airbase and missile silo were destroyed in a first strike, India could still hit back from the bottom of the ocean. India's nuclear policy is called a no first use. They will not start a nuclear war, but if one starts one, they will finish it. Let's make this more concrete. Imagine if you're a military planner and your commander says take India, then what do you actually need to do? Step 1 is you need to try and neutralize 1.4 billion people, which is more people than the entire continent of Africa and more people than all of America and Europe combined. Whatever country you're coming from is gonna be smaller than the country you're trying to take. By every modern metric, trying to conquer India is unthinkable. India's geography literally walls you out. The military can bleed you dry, and then you have the nuclear triad. End of story. Except this isn't the end of the story, because everything I just told you has a problem. India is not completely surrounded by walls because India has one front door. Every land invasion of India in recorded history has come through the same corridor. A small set of mountain passes in the northeast, the Khyber Pass, the Bolan Pass, a handful of others, that is the front door. The Aryans came through here, the Persians came through here, Alexander the Great came through here, the Huns, the Arabs, the Turks, the Mongols, the Mughals, the Afghans, every single one of them the same corridor, the same passes over and over for 3,000 years. The geography everyone points to as India's great defense, the mountains, the deserts, and the ocean, does not completely seal India off. It funnels everyone through the same door. And here's the thing that nobody making an India is impossible to invade video never mentions. They all got through. In 326 BC, Alexander the Great reached India, and he fought one major battle in the Punjab against an Indian king named Porus, and he won. But he won it badly. He lost so many of his best cavalry that when he tried to push further east, his army mutinied at a river called the Bees and refused to continue. Alexander the Great, the man who conquered the entire known world from Greece to Persia, never actually reached the Ganges Plain. He saw the front door of India, looked through it, and then turned around. Alexander the Great was not a fluke. He was the first in a very long pattern. India has been invaded many times by a lot of people. The Mongols tried and failed, but their descendants, the Mughals, eventually succeeded. The Persians under Nadir Shah, the Afghans, and eventually the British. So India is not a sealed fortress, it's a country with one front door that many people have walked through. So the question isn't really can you invade India, because people have. The real question is why hasn't nobody been able to stay? For 2,000 years, India was the wealthiest place on Earth. Until around 1700, India produced roughly a quarter of global GDP. Sometimes more. Everyone wanted it and everyone came for it. And every single one of them eventually either left, fell apart, or was swallowed by the place they thought they had conquered. So India is not that hard to invade. India is hard to digest. By 1760, an Indian Hindu confederacy called the Marathas had built an empire that stretched from Tamil Nadu in the south to Punjab in the north. That's nearly the entire subcontinent. For the first time in centuries, Indians themselves were within one battle of unifying India under a single power. The battle was Panipat, January 14, 1761. The Marathas fought an Afghan army under Ahmad Shah Durrani, and they lost. The empire fragmented overnight. The unification of India, the closest anyone had ever came, collapsed in a single afternoon. Even Indians themselves could not hold India, which kind of tells you something. It's not about foreign invaders being weak, there's something about India itself. Here's the pattern that historians keep returning to. Every invader who's came to India as a foreign conqueror, within just a few generations, their descendants are speaking Indian languages, marrying Indian families, eating Indian food, worshipping Indian gods, or building Indian forms of their own religion, and becoming slowly indistinguishable from the people they had once conquered. The Aryans assimilated, the Huns were absorbed, and the Turks who founded the Delhi Sultanate were Indianized within 2 generations. The Mughals are the textbook case. Babur, the founder, wrote in Persian and complained constantly about the heat. 3 generations later, his great-grandson Akbar had married Hindu princesses, employed Hindu generals, and tried to build an entirely new religion, the Dini Lai, that fused Islam and Hinduism into something that had never existed before. The Mughals came in as Central Asian conquerors, and within a century they were more Indian than anyone else. But the British were the first major invaders who actively refused to assimilate. They built clubs that Indians were not allowed to enter, and they sent their children to England to be raised. They drew a hard line between ruler and ruled, and that refusal became Indian is part why eventually their rule generated the resistance that ended it. So you don't really conquer India, India conquers you back. The British Empire held India for 200 years, longer than any other invader, and here is how they actually did it. At the peak of British rule, there were 70,000 British soldiers in India, governing 300 million people. The real army that conquered India was the East India Company force, which was roughly 90% India sepoys. Indian soldiers and Indian officers at the lower ranks fighting under a British flag. The British did not outfight India, they out-organized a fragmented India and recruited locally. They conquered India with Indians, and in 1857, when those Indian soldiers turned on them, the rebellion nearly brought the entire British Raj down. The British held on by a thread, and they never fully trusted their position again. The longest-lasting conquest of India only worked because the conqueror hired the conqueror to do the conquering, and even that nearly failed. India has enemies everywhere, Pakistan to the west, China to the north, and the Indian Ocean contested in every direction. Can anyone actually conquer it? You have the mountains, the army, the nuclear submarines. It's basically unthinkable. But the deeper answer here is the same one that exhausted the Mughals and made the British pack up and leave. India is a continent pretending to be a country, 22 official languages, 1,000 spoken ones, and hundreds of ethnic groups. Everything that made holding India impossible in 1700 still makes it impossible in 2026. You can maybe imagine an army strong enough to take it, but you cannot imagine an army strong enough to govern it. Every empire that came to India thought they had cracked the code, and every one of them either left, fell apart, or became Indian. And maybe that's the real answer. The reason India is impossible to conquer is not the geography, it's not the military, and it's not the nukes. It's that sooner or later you're not the invader, you're just another person who came to India and stayed. I'm Jake Explains, and I cover rising and falling countries and where the world's going, so make sure you subscribe for more. Also, I'm going to be going to India for the first time this year, so make sure you stay tuned for that.